Hello, everyone. I'd like to give you some feedback on weeks 2 through 3. First, I would like to say well done on another great week. You had some very interesting conversations in your discussion boards and as well in your journal submission. So thank you for that. I'd like you to be on the lookout, especially in the discussion boards. If somebody does ask you a question, that you do make the effort to go in and answer their prompt, even if it might be, above your limit that you had to do for the week. I think it does help with class interaction, and maybe you can clarify and enhance someone else's understanding of a topic. You did a great job with your CNL experience projects. I really appreciated how you did look at your own experiences in order to justify why a situation was outside of your traditional spaces or your normal comfort zone. You demonstrated to me that you were able to look at a situation and start seeing through some of the lenses that we talk about in this class, kind of making connections with the course content, with the topics that we're discussing. I'm also starting to see that many of you have some interests that you might want to kind of foster and maybe follow when you start to think about your final project. I will be talking about your final project more in the next week. The topic for your final project is open, so I would encourage you to follow an area of your interest. If you're passionate about a particular topic, you may want to dig a little bit deeper into that. For example, someone was talking about cultural representations in Marvel movies. That's something that you could take, do a little bit more analysis, and turn that into a final project. Someone else was talking about economic justice, so thinking about how you could expand that into a final project. Your final project will be something that you perform, and I use that word perform loosely. What that could mean is that you are gathering information kind of from a research perspective that you want to share with the public, either through a face-to-face meeting or in an online kind of communication. Or maybe you're interested in creating an activity or an experience that you would like to share with others. This could be a short lesson in whatever context that you're working in. I've had students present some things to their bosses about maybe diversity-related training at their place of work. There are a lot of opportunities for the final project, and you get a lot of freedom to design it as you would like to design it. The main purpose is that you're utilizing the content from the course to guide your decision making in the process of putting together your final project. I'd also like you to consider working in a group. I know this is an online class and that's not always easy to do, but that way you're also getting the benefit of working with others and trying to collaborate and include different and diverse perspectives in your own creation of the assignment. I promise you there will be more information in the next week or two about that, but I just wanted to get you thinking about what your topic could be for that project. So I want to bring your attention to some of the historic information that you've been learning and also that you've been commenting about in the small groups. So when we look at things that are happening in today's society, in current events, it's difficult for us to see them accurately unless we have an understanding of the history that led up to those situations. Now, it's impossible for everyone to understand the long history, every different element that went into the current event of today, but it's our responsibility to educate ourselves on these issues. So let's think about, for example, the idea of reparations. And what this means would be physical or monetary compensation for the distress caused by slavery in American history towards African Americans. Sometimes just the mention of reparations brings anxiety or defensiveness in white people. And this connects too to some people who mention this idea of understanding blame when we talk about white privilege and white history. So if you're interested, you could do a little bit of research on the case for reparations, particularly in connection with Ta-Nehisi Coates. He recently testified before Congress about this topic and has written extensively about it. So you'll be able to find a greater understanding of some of the intricacies of what this means. But again, we can't really understand it until we're looking through a long lens of history, and many of us don't know that history. So when we talked about the immigration process, I really appreciated a lot of your discussions on the Flipgrid. Also, people were bringing up the issue to me privately in email. Somebody posted on the Teams group. So we know that when we're talking about the immigration process, that it's very timely as well. You could see from your own investigation that the immigration process for the U.S. is very complex. There are many different moving parts, many of them that are time-based, and also in many cases it's quite arbitrary. Certain documentation may or may not be needed, but don't forget that documentation, because it could be something that stops your process or causes your case to be denied. We can think about this immigration process internally within the U.S., but we also need to consider how global factors affect this immigration, or not even immigration, migration process. So people have been migrating since the beginning of time. It's just a matter of how our nation-state boundaries have influenced how that happens. And I know for many of you, current events have put this into perspective, and a different perspective. So for those of you that are passionate about this, it could be also an area to investigate further for your final project. Next, I'd like to move into a discussion about language. Many of you mentioned the idea of dialect or accent and whether you have one or don't have one. And I think it's also interesting that some students in the class who only speak English really kind of struggled with talking about language. So I always encourage people, even if you don't learn it well, even if you never plan on using it, studying a different language and the processes of learning will give you an entirely new perspective on working with language learners, even if you just download an app like Duolingo or something, and think about what it means to really learn a different language. And as you worked through the readability activity, many of you brought up things like, what is good writing, right? Or this idea of what does it mean to dumb things down? And I actually, you could see, wrote that in like red and crossed it out, if you can see that as well. When we talk about what needs to be included in a sentence, how long a sentence can be or should be, different kinds of clauses that we want to include in that, there are varying opinions about that. And you can imagine for someone learning the language, long, involved, complex sentences may not be easy for students to produce. And as someone who's worked with a lot of language learners, particularly adults, sometimes that pressure for good writing leads people to use translation services. So they'll write this beautifully long sentence in the language they're thinking in, convert it to English, and a lot of times, many times, it just doesn't make sense in the same way in English. This pressure for good writing also can lead to plagiarism and cheating. So when a student is shut down, when work is not accepted because the quality of writing isn't, and I'm going to use quotations, good enough or good enough writing, it leads students to pursue other avenues to complete their work. And when we're talking about making something comprehensible, making something easier for students to grasp, that does not mean that you are dumbing down the information. I would say that as a teacher, it's my job to take complex information, split it up into parts, re-explain it multiple ways, whatever is necessary for a student to comprehend those ideas. So I would encourage you to try and erase that phrase from your vocabulary when working with students and talking about making adaptations in content or making content really comprehensible for all students. Some of you brought up this idea of gauging proficiency, language proficiency, and it is a very difficult thing to do. If you remember anything from this section, please remember the difference between BICS and CALP, which your MEPS textbook does bring up. So BICS is basic interpersonal communicative skills, and CALP is cognitive academic language proficiency. When you are interacting with someone who speaks multiple languages, it can be deceiving because some people are very strong in BICS or their social language, but are weaker in CALP. And CALP often shows up in academic writing or, for example, like the language of academic content. And also there's times where that is reversed, where CALP is stronger than BICS. I just caution you when you're talking about language proficiency, unless you are an English language development specialist or someone that has a knowledge of multiple languages, be careful how you judge a student's or anyone's proficiency in a language. It is a lot more complex than, oh yeah, they can talk to me about lots of things. As you could see from the lectures, language proficiency really touches on many dimensions and many different elements. So I want to circle around back and ask you who are going to be future teachers, what are you really assessing in the classroom? What I mean by this is how can you help students, regardless of their language proficiency, show what they know in the course? A student may not have the CALP proficiency to write an extended essay, but they may be able to convey the information that you are looking for in a different way that may not be as linguistically heavy. And don't forget that many students have this content knowledge in other languages. They just don't have it in English. So always keep that in your mind as well. There was a statement written by the National Council for the Teachers of English, and it was all about students' right to their own language, that our classrooms need to be linguistically humane so that all languages are welcomed. Not necessarily in a bilingual context, that's not always possible or practical, but definitely from an inclusionary perspective. That culture and language should be sustained to whatever extent possible. The greater the extent, the better, of course, as a way to help students develop their identity and engage with course content, and also to keep close connections with their family, which is also important for supporting education. And from the workplace standpoint, if you are allowing employees or co-workers to fully realize their linguistic and cultural identities in the workplace, that's only going to make for a more welcoming environment and a more productive environment from the work standpoint as well.